Have you ever looked at a piece of Ogham and wondered what was it actually for? Not what people say now with tree calendars and divination decks, but like really, why did our Irish ancestors carve these markings into stone in the first place all those years ago? I mean, it's a fair question. You might have seen Ogham used on tattoos, on book covers, even in fantasy games, or, referred to in New Age literature. But there's a massive gap between what people think Ogham was for and what we actually know from the archaeology and manuscript sources. So, in this episode, we're going to clear that up. You'll learn what Ogham was really used for, who used it, where, and why, and where some of the biggest myths came from, too. So, I'm going to show you exactly where to start learning it properly. And if you want a visual, I do recommend that you get the guide. It is free below at the link, and you can download it and have it open as you're watching this video, or just get it after. That's fine. So Ogham, Ogham, or Ogham, spelled Ogam in Old Irish, is the earliest known form of written Irish. Now, it's not a language in itself. It's not a code or a tree oracle. It is a script. It is an alphabet, a writing system. And it was made, designed, delivered to represent the sounds of our most primitive Irish language, the first stages that we know of our language here on the island of Ireland, long before Gaeilge as we speak it today. So it's not just some esoteric alphabet. It's how our people first wrote their names, their kinship lines, their ancestry, and probably a whole lot more that we'll never know because most of it was done on wood and only the stones have survived, which is one reason why it's hard to date it, unfortunately. Now, if you've downloaded that free guide, then you'll see that we've broken down the main uses and meanings that are backed up by the sources. So let's go through some of that in the video here today. So commemoration and identity would be the first use really for Ogham. And the majority of the 400 plus known Ogham stones here in Ireland and another 100 or so on the island of Britain, our neighbouring island, are from what we would call the classical or monumental Ogham phase. So that's from about the 4th to the 7th century Common Era, roughly. But again, it's hard to give a definitive date for the earliest recording of Ogham. You cannot carbon date stone. So all of it is contextual. And unfortunately, these Ogham stones have often been moved around. And we do have some linguistic dating as well. But that's all maybe a little bit too complicated for this video. That's okay. I understand it, so you don't have to. But during that time, at least that time, people were carving Ogham onto standing stones to mark something. And usually it was a name. So it followed, most commonly, writing follows a kind of a formula. So it's like X, son of Y, of the people Z, and fill in the blanks, obviously, for the X, Y, and Z. So if you're looking at transliterations of inscriptions, what you're going to see is words like Maki, which is Maqi in the very oldest Irish, which would be Mac in modern Irish, Mac. You'll see other words for descendant or words that connect people to tribal groups or ancestors. And these weren't random letters, of course. They were identity markers, public statements. This land belongs to such and such of such and such a lineage, and that was very important to our ancestors. And that function of marking the land, the ancestry, the status, who was from what tribe, who was of whose people, might explain why some of the stones were placed on boundaries or reused later in churches or souterrains or even as grave markers because people valued them. but they also held that heritage and held that lineage. So I have to wonder from personally, now we don't have definitive records of this within archaeology, certainly, but I have to wonder if there wasn't some kind of spiritual or magical element to placing an ancestrally important stone at a boundary, which maybe was a boundary between your land and the land of a neighboring tribe. I mean, there could be something in that. But as far as we know, it was just for the ancestral lineages. They may have held some kind of protective power. And there is some folklore about that too, which has survived through the ages. Well, let's get into the legal and land ownership functions, because there is fairly good reason to believe that Ogham stones would have had this kind of legal significance too. Early Irish law tracts would reference proof of land ownership, and this is often referred to as the Brehon law system. So pre the British legal system that was imposed on us through colonization, we had our own native legal system, which was the Brehon law system. And it's very likely that an inscribed stone was one way to show whose land you were standing on, and for it to be a legal marker in that way, especially if it had your ancestor's name carved on it. So we don't have a full, manual, unfortunately, that says this is how the Ogham was used legally. That legal tract has not survived if it ever existed. But the patterns that we see in the inscriptions and the context where the stones were found do tell us a lot, especially when we cross check with old manuscripts and other law texts. And you'll see this explored more through this channel and through our blog as well at the Ogham Academy. So then we're getting into ecclesiastical and scholastic use. And this is really where it gets interesting. Well, I think this is where I'm most interested, because I am more interested in the mythological, folklore, cultural, and social traditions that would be associated with Ogham. Now, this is just personal preference rather than the archaeology or linguistics. But obviously, all are relevant, which is why I have studied and cover all angles from the authentic Ogham lore and literature. So, there is a lot of Ogham stones that are found near early Christian sites, so churches, monastic settlements, and some scholars have definitely figured or decided that the church invented Ogham, the church here in Ireland. But logically, we know that that's not right. It's debated, of course it is, but we know that it's not right because Ogham most likely predates Christianity in Ireland. You have experts like David Stifter, who again was studying the linguistics, is an expert in Old Irish, literally wrote the book on learning Old Irish, and has gone on record in his printed literature, his own books on the topic, and articles and conference lectures and all the rest of it that I would have heard over the years. He would believe that it's at least likely or probable. I'm being very cautious. I know I'm being really cautious because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. And it's really hard to be definitive about this. But when you have an expert in early Irish linguistics looking at it and saying it probably predates, or at least possibly or potentially predates Christianity based on the linguistics, then, I'm going to weigh in with that. And there is very much a nativist versus anti-nativist schism within academics who study Irish manuscripts, literature, lore, archaeology, all the rest of it. So I believe that Ogham predates Christianity in Ireland for sure. And many of the Christian carvings that we do get on Ogham stones or in Ogham are later additions on top of already inscribed stones. So they added crosses, for example, to something that already had native value and power. And then we move into the manuscript tradition. So after about the 7th century, around the 600s Common Era, when stone inscriptions mostly stop, not entirely, but mostly stop, we see Ogham kind of popping back up in medieval books, manuscripts, like the Book of Ballymote, for example. And that's where we get the Ogham tract with like over 100 variations of the script. So it became part of the scholarly toolkit. And there is a playlist on this channel as well where I'm going through some of that manuscript material, such as Orcept Nanakis, the Scholar's Primer. So definitely check that out if you are interested. And one, like, the Ogham was being used, and that's kind of the point that I really like about the manuscript tradition, because it was being used creatively, it was being used socially, it, went on to, it was probably being used magically. There is an amber bead in the British Museum. Give us back our artifacts, please. But in the British Museum that was found, I believe, around Ennis in County Clare somewhere, I think, and has ended up in the British Manuscript, the British Museum even, because, they stole a lot of our stuff and haven't given it back yet. But it has what's possibly a charm to aid in childbirth inscribed in Ogham upon an amber bead. So again, we don't really have a date for that. It's really hard if you don't have a proper context for it. And it's hard to get to see artifacts like that apart from the stones that really have survived in their own context. And unfortunately, a lot of those have since been moved as well and are housed in various museums, including our own. But there is, for example, notes in a note, the most famous one, and I often reference it, is there's a note in the margin of one of the medieval manuscripts. And it basically says, in Ogham, it spells out Lehert, which is the ale killed me, could be a translation of that. And you can kind of picture the poor fella who is like very, very hungover, trying to copy a psalm and scribbling that in like for a bit of crack. So even then, the Ogham had emotional weight, and social weight. But it also shows that the Ogham survived, and it wasn't just fossilized. It became part of this poetic, possibly magical, and even the playful culture of medieval scribes. Now, what the Ogham was not, we need to be really clear about what the Ogham wasn't and isn't. And it was never a full magical system, unfortunately. And if it was, that lore has not survived again. So there's no ancient tree calendar. That came from Robert Graves. Again, I have other videos on this channel, which you can absolutely go and look up about the nonsense that has been written and perpetuated within neo-paganism about the Ogham. But none of that tree calendar stuff, or certainly no kind of Celtic astrology or any of that crap, comes from our native manuscripts, not from the archaeological records. It is a purely poetic, whimsical invention from the 1940s, not a cultural tradition. So just be aware of that. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't explore Ogham in your own spiritual work. I do, for sure, and magical work. But if you want to work with it respectfully, you really, really need to understand where the solid roots are. And that's why I made that free Ogham guide. That's why I do this content. That's why I started the Ogham Academy. And you'll get links to all of that below. And definitely, again, get that free guide for yourself because it's a great start. So to answer the question that we began with, what was Ogham for? Well, it was for naming. It was for remembering. It was for boundary setting. It was for identity. And over time, it evolved into memory, into poetry, into pride. And if this has sparked something in you, curiosity, a little pride yourself, or even a desire to learn more, definitely grab your free copy of that quick and easy Ogham reference guide. Link is below, and it really is the best place to start with accurate information drawn straight from the sources. So thanks for listening, Akara, my friend. Until next time, may your path be rooted and your language be living. Slán go fóill.